All right. Well, everyone, I am really excited to be able to share with you about social and emotional learning. This has been kind of central to my life work for the last over a dozen years. And so when I think about how I might summarize or share just a small amount with you, I feel like I am incredibly challenged. It's like, oh, so much pressure. What will I share that will resonate, that's meaningful? And so the question that I held in my mind as I prepared for this session, given that this is the final session in your series, that we're towards the end of April, the question I held in my mind was, how might social and emotional learning support us to finish strong this year at this time? And so that will be sort of the frame that I'll hold. And I'm hoping that you will make some connections in that way. If you have ever attended a session on social and emotional learning, I am almost certain you will have seen this quote before. So we're going back to what we call the beginning of SEL. And many of our social scientists and practitioners in the field of SEL like to suggest that SEL has been around for a really long time. And as such, we use Aristotle to say, ooh, look at the roots of SEL. They are deep. Educating the mind without educating the heart is really no education at all. And I used to hear this quote and I used to put it in all of my presentations, and I put it in today. And more recently, I've been thinking about, we are really doing a disservice when we use this as the quote to demonstrate the roots of SEL. So I want to nudge our collective thinking, and maybe you've already been thinking this for quite some time, but just to nudge our thinking a little bit, to consider Indigenous ways of knowing and being in relation to social and emotional learning. And so really that's what I'd like to ground ourselves in as the roots of social and emotional or holistic learning and well-being. We know that learning from an Indigenous perspective includes all four aspects of our being: mind, body, emotion, and spirit. And so I'm hoping that you'll see the connections between mind, body, emotion, and spirit in some of the practical applications I share this afternoon. And also just to notice that this notion of emotional intelligence, which is my field of study, emotional well-being, emotional literacy, again, that this is not a new concept. It's simply been westernized and mobilized out as if it's a new idea. But social and emotional learning can be rooted in compassion, empathy, and care. And in that way, there is intelligence and knowing there. And finally, from a Mayan scholar who shares, "You are my other me." And I love this idea because it helps us to see that our learning always happens in community. We are not isolated, and what is going on for me relates to what's going on for you, and this creates community. And community will be a little bit of a theme as well that hopefully I will weave through our time together. So when we think about social and emotional learning, besides considering these roots of what it is, we often define social and emotional learning as a process of developing and acquiring skills that we need, skills, competencies, attributes, or characteristics that we need to be successful in our relationships and learning and overall in life. And CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, has very neatly and discreetly described 5 giant clusters of competencies, and you'll see them here. And really, I like to think about SEL in this way, that social and emotional learning is first about developing a healthy identity, knowing who we are, having a strong sense of self-concept, having that positive personal and cultural identity. That social and emotional learning also involves managing our emotions. So knowing how we feel, being able to label our emotions, being able to set and achieve goals to persevere and reach those goals, whether that's individual or collective. Again, that sense of community. Social and emotional learning includes this idea of experiencing empathy and demonstrating active empathy, which is compassion for others, and establishing and maintaining supportive or healthy relationships, and finally making responsible and caring decisions that are both personally and socially, ethically, morally responsible. So another goal, we're doing a lot of weaving at the beginning part here. So another goal that I have is for us to see how social and emotional learning and our core competencies, how they're interrelated. And we won't spend much time on this today, but definitely it's something to continue to explore further. But just to see how communication, collaboration, creative and critical thinking, and then the facets related to personal and social responsibility, how these all come together within these clusters of skills. And so you can see here on the slide, there are dozens of skills that relate to each castle slice of the pie competency, as well when we think about what are these relationships between the core competencies. There are many. So I've had a big discussion recently with some peers about how we have been using the term reimagine so frequently. It's like a time marker. You know that when we say reimagining, it's something from the last couple of years. And so a couple of years ago, I wrote my proposal for my dissertation, and Leighton is deeply familiar with this. And I named my proposal Reimagining Social and Emotional Learning. And so this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. And so I invite you into reimagining this with me. So we know that SEL is this process of acquiring skills and competencies, that it's about holistic, whole human, wholehearted development. And from my dissertation, what I learned from my participants is that many of them share that SEL is a way of being, and that SEL isn't just something you do once, but it influences all aspects of teaching and learning. Right? So it's part of who we are. There is a current shift away from singular lessons and programs. And this is a little bit tricky because singular lessons, like that explicit content about, I don't know, peaceful problem solving or negotiating conflict, those are really helpful. We need some explicit content, but there's a move to deepen this work. And that move includes looking at ourselves and what we bring into the classroom, considering our instructional practices, and so on. And so my dissertation really had focused on this question of where does SEL live outside of programs? And so that's part of what's informing what I'll share with you today. And when I think about this and what folks shared with me and what I saw through my study and 3 years and years of this work, is that SEL includes a number of different aspects. So again, moving away from an explicit program that you take and drop into your classroom and say, okay, it's SEL time, kids, we're gonna learn our social and emotional skills, and then you do your lesson. That might have value, but in fact, there's recent research that shows with adolescents, that type of standalone lesson has less sticking power than it does with elementary students. So it resonates more with elementary, that standalone block of time that's around explicit instruction of social and emotional skills, but less impactful for adolescents. So moving away from that, we know that SEL, first and foremost, is about building relationships with students, with families, and communities. This is a relational practice. If I tell you, work on your emotion regulation skills, but actually you hate me, chances are you're probably not going to learn emotion regulation skills. Or you will learn some other skills to demonstrate how much you dislike me, right? And so we need this relational aspect to be present in our work. Social and emotional learning happens within caring learning communities, and this is a huge factor of social and emotional learning. That, in fact, we need to attend to the learning community so that it's through the community we can mobilize this work. There is a huge component that's modeling. So this should sound familiar because Leighton just shared about SRL and talked about modeling, and that's not a program either. SRL is not a program. So with modeling, we are demonstrating our own social and emotional competencies all the time. There are spontaneous teachable moments. So there might be something that happens in your classroom or in the school, and it just surfaces and you realize, wow, we really need to attend to this situation. And so there might be an entry point there for social and emotional learning. SEL includes this idea of routines and rituals. So this is moving towards more of your instructional practice where we have familiar routines that are set up, that are designed, that students can take up and apply social and emotional skills in meaningful, authentic ways. So that application isn't like, okay, kids, it's time for you to apply those SEL skills. It's more that you have designed a learning opportunity for students. And through that learning opportunity, so maybe it's part of your, I don't know, your lit circle that you're doing, through that lit circle, kids are exchanging ideas, they're listening to others, they're navigating social relationships within that particular routine. And that's set up and familiar in your classroom. And relatedly, we want opportunities to embed SEL into curricular content. So again, it's not this standalone. So we don't just do, you know, flashcards of emotion recognition, but as we're reading Harbor Me by Jacqueline Woodson, we're looking at the characters and noticing how they're feeling and what's caused them to feel that way. And maybe what inferences we can make about their gestures or how we imagine their tone of voice to be. And that's emotional literacy embedded into the content that we're already studying. All right, folks, you hanging in there? Hopefully you're doing all right. So I thought it was really clever to come up with all of those ways that social and emotional learning has pathways in our classrooms. And it turns out there's really no original idea. And Transforming Education already came up with this beautiful graphic that shows how dynamic and multifaceted social and emotional learning is. So we think about strong SEL as the center of this, I don't know, prismatic shape here. This is that sort of dynamic skill learning and application. And it's happening through these multiple entry points. And for some of us, these entry points, some entry points are more accessible than others. For some of us, we feel really confident in our relationship building and maybe around explicit instruction, but less sure about practice opportunities or less sure about modeling. Right? The goal here with SEL is that we don't just focus on one pathway, but that we're looking at building multiple pathways so that the skills that are learned are stronger for both ourselves and our students. Okay, so what does this mean in practice? Whew. All right. So when I think about this, I just shared that SEL is contextual, it's responsive, and relational. And so how can I distill a few practical examples that also demonstrate some sort of understanding of context that is responsive and relational? And so I recognize our context is a completely unscripted type of year. That my responsivity is that most of the folks that I'm working with, the teachers I'm working with, don't want an extra thing to do. I also recognize that at the end of the year, many of the SEL practices we talk about have been building for the year. So I want to honor the work that you're doing. And that relational piece, hopefully that I will connect with you through a little bit of a story. So with this in mind, how might SEL supportive practices and routines help us to finish strong? So here's the context. I first have to admit that one of my strengths, so speaking of self-awareness and modeling, is I am really good at starting things. I am less strong at finishing them. That is not intentional French. but I do see French was a theme. So, all right. So with our context, what we recently heard is that in a marathon, the last miles are the hardest, the toughest. And so I'm going to share a little story about over a decade ago, my 30th birthday was on the horizon. And I thought, oh my gosh, 30 is so old. I've changed my mind about that thinking. I used to think 30 was old, and now I think it's quite young. And I decided for my 30th birthday, I would run a marathon, because why not? And if you're going to run a marathon, why not run the Great Wall of China Marathon? As I said, I'm really good at starting things. I'm great with big ideas. And so I trained. I lived in Port Moody at the time, and I trained and I trained and I practiced all through the winter months. I'd never run a marathon before, just a couple of half marathons. And I thought, this is great. I'm ready. I've trained. I'm ready. And I flew to Beijing, and I arrived in May, and it was boiling hot, absolutely stifling hot. And I realized, uh-oh, I did not train for that. And so I was a little worried, and I stayed the night before the race in what's called a farm tel, which is like a hostel, but it's actually a farm with just a bed on the ground. And that did not help my sleep. But I stayed in this farm tel, and the next morning I woke up and I was super excited. Oh my gosh, I am about to run the Great Wall Marathon in China. How incredible. And I got to the start line, and it was just chaos. All the races, the 5K, 10K, half and full marathon, all started together. Total chaos. I imagine our classrooms feel like this sometimes. So I started the race, the gun went off, and I felt like, ooh, I've got this competitive edge. And I was running up 5 kilometers up a mountain, and then eventually got on the wall. And I will make a long story a little bit shorter and share that the run was incredible. You run through villages and remote places, but it was very hot. And I ran out of fuel. And about 5 kilometers left in the race, I left the village and I hopped back on the wall, and I was doing really well for time. And I felt like, amazing, like I got this. And it turns out that proverbial runners hitting the wall piece was both metaphorical and literal for me. And I hit the wall. And I became so ill, like throwing up off the side of the Great Wall of China. And I just lay there, and I couldn't get up. And I was there for so long that they actually closed the race. They started to close the race course. So I needed to get past that point in order to finish. Otherwise I wouldn't finish. Anyways, I was just in the depths of despair. I felt like I thought I was ready. I tried so hard. I'm so sick. Lots of runners came by to offer help. Swiss runners came by and offered chocolate cake, because apparently they carry that in their backpacks when they run. They're amazing. And I was there for about an hour, and someone ran up to me and said, hey, you're not going to make it. I said, I'm not at all. You're right. And he said, you know what? The only way you're going to be able to do it is if we do it together. And I was so out of it that I could hardly move. I was like stumbling and crawling. And he put his arm under my arm, and he hoisted me up, and we climbed the wall together. And eventually we made it down the wall, and you could see the finish line. And of course, I suddenly had a spurt of adrenaline and could trot through that finish line like no big deal. And I never saw him again. I'm not sure who he is. I only know that he was from Toronto. So I feel like, yeah, Canada, way to represent. But this is what I'm thinking about when I think about finish strong. I did not finish strong. I finished, but I was not able to finish by myself. I needed someone to help me. So in just a minute, we're going to send you off into groups. But before we do that, I want to just make some sense of why I bothered to share that story with you. When we think about social and emotional learning, we always talk about that it starts with ourself. And given the context of where we are in this year, both in the time point, but also in this year of multiple pandemics, I already know that we are always modeling social and emotional competencies. And I don't think it will help you if I say you need to make sure that you are modeling beautiful self-care, that you're modeling well-being. Because many of us are limping towards the finish line right now. And so if we think about saying that to our students, we would just never say that. But we would think about, how can we move to a community of care? What can we do to take care of each other as we finish out the year? And so you've seen the emotional literacy charter. I know that Leighton shared it before, and I just want to have you think about and hold in your mind's eye, how is it that you want to feel for the remainder of the year? And as a community of adults, what can you do together to foster that feeling? Maybe you want to just, get to the finish line. Maybe you want to have an inspired finish. And I'm not sure, but you can think about what behaviors you can have for yourself to support that feeling, and maybe what are your needs. This is the same conversation we can have with our students. How is it that they want to feel as they finish out the year? Because at the beginning of the year, we always do a lot to create community agreements. We say SEL is housed in this nurturing community, but it didn't just happen once in September. We're maintaining and returning to that over time. And so right now in this time of year, I'm not going to say to educators for SEL, start with yourself, take care of yourself. Instead, I'm going to invite you as educators to think about how you might take care of each other, and then also bring that practice into your classroom. So at this point of the year, what opportunities do you have to revisit how you might maintain your community agreements? How might, as a team, as a class, as a community, how might you all finish strong? What would that look like? What might it sound like? And so I know you need to head over to a breakout room. And so here are a couple of ideas for you to talk about, although we all know you're going to talk about whatever you need. And so first, the idea of connecting. So how do these ideas or practices that we've shared so far, both Leighton and myself, connect to what you already know and do? So honor the work that you're doing. What are some ideas that might nudge your thinking right now and maybe nudge your practice? Oh, I realize I haven't shared much about practice yet. That's coming. And then maybe just articulate what challenges or questions or puzzles do you have?